Right, let's start on the hour.
All right.
Hello and welcome everybody to the TESOL International Conference and this session by Dennis Laffey entitled Korean Students Vocabulary Learning Strategies in the 21st Century. I'm rather eager to gain some insight and some ideas. So I'm going to hand over to Dennis now. Thank you very much, Dennis.
Okay, thank you. Let me get my PPT started here. There we go. Oops. Okay, that's working. All right, everybody. Hello, my name is Dennis Laffey, and I am the assistant professor of English at Bukkyung National University. And as was promised, my presentation today is Korean University Students' Vocabulary Learning Strategies in the 21st Century. So as you probably know, vocabulary learning strategies are actions that learners take to assist them in understanding and integrating new vocabulary, and they're a key part of the vocabulary acquisition process. Some foundational research into VLS by researchers such as Oxford in 1990, O'Malley and Chamot also in 1990, Schmidt in 1997 identified and classified a lot of VLS. Especially Schmidt's 1997 chapter in Schmidt and McCarthy's Vocabulary Description, Acquisition, and Pedagogy presented a very detailed list of VLS divided between those for meaning discovery and those for consolidation into the learner's inner language. This also provided some self-report data from English learners at middle school, high school, university, and adult learner levels as to which VLS they used and how helpful they found the different VLS to be. Many studies since then have referenced Schmidt's taxonomy, and over the years, a few studies have replicated it, but not very many. So I thought it was kind of important to take a look and see, how things might be changing since this, foundational study was published. So in the past 30 years, of course, communicative language teaching has kind of become the default assumption for a lot of English classrooms. And of course, courses still use more, formalist methods or, different types of methodologies. But in general, a lot of stated goals for English programs are to produce good English communicators. And in addition, we've had, of course, the rise of the internet and big advances in computers and smartphones and tablets and things that are changing people's behaviors. So in light of these two things, I thought the assumption that the numbers that Schmidt presented 25 years ago are still accurate may not really be a safe assumption. So to investigate this, I took Schmidt's taxonomy and I updated it in a few ways to reflect reported technology use by students. So I added 6 meaning discovery VLS to Schmidt's list and 2 consolidation strategies to his list. These were based on discussions I'd had with my own students, with some of my own previous research and some other people's research that I'd been reading. This resulted in a total of 20 meaning discovery VLS and 46 consolidation VLS in a revised version of the survey. Then I went and I administered the survey to 135 students at Korean universities. And among the participants, most of them were English majors. There were 43 males and 90 females who responded to the survey, plus 2 students who declined to list a gender. The students were primarily 2nd, 3rd, and 4th year of study. A majority of participants rated themselves as either low or high intermediate level proficiency, which based on the examples I've given, rates to roughly B1 or B2 level on the CEFR scale. And almost all the participants were native Korean speakers, but there were a handful of Chinese, English, and 1 Portuguese speaker who took the survey. Okay, now you can see here's a couple of screenshots I took from the online survey using Google Forms. I recreated the survey online, and instructions and all items, as you can see, were in both English and in Korean. The Korean was checked by a couple of people, colleagues, and also my wife helped a bit with that. Certain VLS I thought might not be familiar to some of the students. So they received extra explanations or sometimes pictures or diagrams to help illustrate the VLS. The students taking the survey, just as Schmidt did in his survey, first they were asked to rate whether they'd ever used the VLS or not. So just a simple yes, no. And then, of course, as Schmidt did, I had them add any VLS that they could think of that weren't on the list, but turns out nobody did. A couple of people wrote down comments, but they were basically the same as things that were already on the list. The next section was asking how helpful the students found the VLS to be. And again, simple yes or no. And at the end of that section, they were asked to rate their top 5 most helpful VLS for both meaning discovery and for consolidation. So 2 separate lists. And when that was all done, I took all that data and I compared it to the data presented by Schmidt back in '97. So 25 years later, student VLS use patterns have changed in a couple of key ways. The first change is that across the board, VLS use is up. And I do have to kind of preface this section. Schmidt did his survey in Japan with Japanese learners. And as I mentioned before, he had middle school, high school, university, and adult learners. I've only got students in Korea at the university level so far. I'm actually in the middle of doing a second study, which I want to try and recruit other age groups. But for my first little trial, I only use the university students. So the numbers maybe don't 100% match up, but I think it's close enough that the conclusions I draw are still valid. At least I hope so. Anyway, every VLS that appeared on Schmidt's survey was compared to the numbers on my survey. But there's some on my survey, obviously, that couldn't be compared because they weren't on Schmidt's or they were suggested by Schmidt's participants, so he doesn't have numbers on them. But for the ones we can compare, on average, the use of VLS, averaging all the changes together, VLS use was up 37.14%. And helpfulness, a few VLS in helpfulness actually decreased in their percentages. For use, none of them were lower. Everything was higher. There were a couple that were lower for helpfulness, but overall, again, the numbers were up. And the increase in helpfulness was 13.96%. So from that, it looks like contemporary Korean students are more likely to employ a variety of VLS when they're studying vocabulary. And most, but not all VLS are considered more helpful than they were to Schmidt's Japanese students 25 years ago. So here are some of the numbers for the VLS. The differences seen in the VLS, which students report that they use. And again, this is just a simple yes, no, have you ever used this or not? So for meaning discovery, which are in blue, you can see the most widely used on my survey are using an online dictionary, using a bilingual dictionary, guessing from context clues, using a smartphone dictionary app, and comparing to a similar known English word. The most used consolidation VLS, which are in black, are taking notes in class, studying the sound of the word, studying the spelling of the word, using verbal repetition, using written repetition, and keeping a vocabulary notebook. You can see the percentages also that Schmidt had gotten from his participants on the left side, the percentages I got from my participants, and the change in red. So 7 of the VLS among the top 10 from Schmidt were also among my top 11 in this case, because you can see some of them tied. But the rankings are a little bit different. The most widely used VLS using an online dictionary wasn't really an option for students back in 1997, at least not for most students. The most widely used consolidation VLS, and the third most overall, taking notes in class, is an interesting one. It was 8th on Schmidt's list, 64%, but it got 96.3% of my students saying they'd used it. The increase in students reporting to have used or at least tried a wide range of VLS suggests that probably classroom instruction, which actually focuses on teaching students explicitly to use vocabulary learning strategies, may be having an effect. Next, looking at helpfulness. As I mentioned earlier, not every strategy increased for helpfulness, but most of them did. But there's a lot more difference from Schmidt's results in the helpfulness. On the top VLS rated as helpful in the current study, we have 3 meaning discovery strategies. And again, they're in blue here. Using an online dictionary, guessing from context clues, and using a bilingual dictionary. And looking at consolidation, we had 10 up at the top because of the ties. So using verbal repetition, imagining the word's meaning, written repetition, keeping a vocabulary notebook, taking notes in class, interacting with a native speaker, connecting the word to a personal experience, using the new word in a sentence, studying the sound of the word, and saying the new word aloud while studying. So among these, only 5 were in the top 10 of Schmidt's 1997 results. Bilingual dictionaries was seen as the most helpful in 1997, but it was only 6th place in my study. And actually a slight reduction in percentage. This was one of the ones that dropped, but only a little bit, only 1.7% lower. So not really much of a change. Most surprisingly, I found imagining the word's meaning, Schmidt actually had that as the 5th lowest VLS from his survey, but it was tied for 3rd most helpful in my survey. And that's an increase of 56.1%. One area that results on both surveys converged is the VLS of skipping or passing a word. That was seen as the least helpful overall on both surveys. But on my survey, it did actually still increase by 12.9%. So generally, the higher ratings for helpfulness suggest to me that increased knowledge of VLS from dedicated instruction has led to students benefiting from more strategic vocabulary acquisition. So not only are they using more VLS, they're finding them helpful. Moving on to the student rankings. This, I think, is maybe the most important aspect of the study. Schmidt in 97 and my study both asked respondents to rank their top 5 most helpful VLS. And I think this gives us a better understanding of which VLS the students actually find to work. Because it's not just helpful, it's the top 5 most helpful. So Schmidt originally used 2 different ways to measure this, so I did the same. First was a flat measure of 1 point for any time the VLS appeared on anybody's top 5 list. It didn't matter what place it was in, it just got 1 point. The second way was the weighted ranking, which you can see here. A first place got 5 points, second place got 4 points, etc. So most instances, both Schmidt's survey and mine, there wasn't really a lot of difference actually in the rankings from weighted or flat rankings. There were places where we had a few transpositions, but not very many. And most of the time they didn't really move that far. But let's take a look here. For meaning discovery, Schmidt found bilingual dictionaries ranked the highest, followed by monolingual dictionaries, and then asking a teacher for a synonym or a paraphrase. On the flat measure, guessing from context was next, followed by analyzing pictures or gestures. But on the weighted rankings, these 2 were reversed in order. And 6th was asking a teacher to give an example sentence. Schmidt did not list the lower ranked VLS in his chapter, so I don't have anything to compare other than these. Although I do have all the numbers for mine, of course. But anyway, in my study, guessing from context clues took the top spot, followed by using a bilingual dictionary. And using a monolingual dictionary came third, using an online dictionary fourth on the flat rating, but these two were reversed in the weighted ratings. Similarly, on the flat rating, next came analyzing the root word and any affixes, followed by using a smartphone dictionary app. And again, the weighted ranks were reversed for these two as well. So it seems like the contemporary Korean students are highly inclined to rely on context clues and also to use the technology that they have available to find out the meaning of a word. And some of these, technologies were unavailable 25 years ago. It seems like they're a lot less likely to rely on a teacher as a resource for finding out the meaning of a new word. Turning to consolidation strategies, we find the top 3 VLS are the same, but the rankings are different in the 2 surveys. So in 97, Schmidt found participants enjoyed, or they found written repetition to be helpful. I shouldn't say enjoyed, they found it helpful. They probably didn't enjoy it. Anyway, that was followed by verbal repetition and continuing to study the word over time on the flat ranking, with the second and third reversed again for the weighted rankings. So the weighted rankings also, written repetition was almost twice that of studying the word over time, and more than twice that of verbal repetition. So you can see out of 3,000 possible points in blue, written repetition got 1,362 points at number 1, and number 2, continuing to study over time, got 732 points, verbal repetition 665 points. So quite a big difference, very heavily favored written repetition. In my study, the same 3 VLS are in the top spots, but verbal repetition is now the most helpful, continuing to study over time second, and written repetition third. For the weighted rankings, written repetition actually came in 4th, and interacting with a native speaker ranked 3rd on the weighted rankings. So weighted rankings for the top 3 or 4 in my study, they're a lot more similar, as you can see. There's no clear preference as there was seen 25 years ago. So my study found interaction with native speakers, using word tests, using English language media were all highly ranked. What's interesting, these 3 VLS were all suggested by participants of Schmidt's original survey, but because they'd been suggested by the students, there's no numbers on them to compare. So looking only at highest ranked VLS, seems to me the same methods remain pretty popular today, but it's a bit more balanced than it was 25 years ago. Okay, so the data in my study shows contemporary students are more likely to utilize strategies than in the past. Then they tend to use, or at least try out, a lot more different strategies. Every strategy that could be compared between the 2 surveys showed an increase in students reporting that they'd used the strategy. For meaning discovery, the trend in VLS is towards technological resources and away from reliance on teachers or other authorities. This may indicate efforts to establish learner autonomy have had some effect, or it may simply be just that smartphones or tablets are faster and more convenient. So that's an area where future studies might shed a bit more light on, which of these is more plausible. For consolidation, the most widely used VLS for consolidation are still self-study methods and more traditional repetition type activities. And the most widely used strategies were not always viewed as the most helpful. Some strategies had only mid-level of report for use, but still seem to be, they ranked favorably in the helpfulness scale. For example, interaction with a native speaker, or using English language media. Some of this may be due to contextual factors. In EFL environment like Korea, there aren't necessarily as many opportunities to interact with native speakers as you might get if you were in an ESL environment studying overseas in an English-speaking country. Of course, there's also possibly cultural factors. We all know there's a big emphasis on memorization and test cramming in Korea. So that may influence students' behaviors as well, and may affect their choice of VLS. But like I said, a lot of students report they're using those memorization style VLS, but they're not every student's finding them helpful. So implications and recommendations that I would make. First of all, for English language learners, I'd say we should encourage students to use technological resources. Okay, sorry, just checking the chat there. We should encourage students to use technological resources for meaning discovery. Most Korean students have easy access to online resources, and so I think we should encourage them to take advantage of them. We may also want to find ways to improve vocabulary consolidation techniques using online or mobile resources. That seems like an area that's underutilized at the moment for Korean students. As educators, I think we need to try and find as many opportunities as we can to provide authentic language interaction for our students. Students seem to think that's helpful, but a lot of them aren't actually taking advantage of it. So if we can provide more opportunities, I think that would be a good thing for the students. At the same time, we also maybe want to encourage a little less reliance on the brute force memorization or repetition style. Because again, as I mentioned, it sees a high level of use, but not necessarily a high level of helpfulness. So I think the data from my study is promising. Korean university level English learners are utilizing a wide array of vocabulary learning strategies, and they find most of them helpful. Technology is mostly used for meaning discovery, which is, seems logical. You just need to look up the word's meaning. You look it up real quick online. Consolidation still tends to be a bit more traditional. If students actually want to integrate the word into their inner language, they need to, keep things, I guess, they're doing what they're used to doing, I should say. Finally, students may need a bit more guidance still in how to evaluate different VLS and come up with like personal VLS strategy suites that are, unique to them and help with their learning styles. And that's something that as teachers, I think we can do to really help them, because then they can, employ the VLS that are most helpful to them. Here's some references I used in preparing this presentation. Thank you everybody for listening, and I'd be happy to discuss my findings and any questions you guys have.
Thank you very much, Dennis. That was very well presented and very interesting.
Thank you.
We have a few short minutes. I see there's already a comment in the chat. So let's start with that. Heidi mentions she wonders if Japanese students prefer written repetition more than Korean students, because the Korean alphabet is phonetic and spelling is seen as a matter of deduction rather than muscle memory.
It's an interesting question. I don't know. I could ask, I mentioned to Garth before the session started, I used to teach in Japan, but that's, I left Japan 14 years ago, so I'm a little out of touch, but I do have a few friends working at universities there. Maybe I could ask them and get back to you on that. But that could be because, if, those of you who know the Japanese writing system, the kana are based on mora, it's not alphabetical like Hangul. And they also use a lot of, Chinese characters, which you have to memorize, basically. So that could be because, the best way to practice, the Chinese characters, kanji, is to write them repeatedly. So yeah, that may be part of it.
Are there any questions? Heidi, did you want to say something?
There's another one in the chat. Somebody has one.
Okay, yeah, but well, if you want to respond.
Actually, there was something else that just really popped out at me, and that was that the students that nowadays see guessing from context as a helpful strategy. I was wondering how they define helpful. Is that helpful in the sense of just getting through the text and finishing, or is it actually helpful in discovering the meaning of the word?
Well, yeah, I didn't do any interviews or follow-ups on the initial survey, so I don't know exactly. I think, because it was up to the students and the participants. Some of them were my students here at Bukkyong, and some of them, one of my friends also gave the survey to his students at a different university. But I could, maybe follow up with a few of my students as well. And, I am working on, like I said, an expanded version of this where I'm going to try to recruit middle school, high school, and if possible, adult learners to see, how things have changed. So adding some, maybe interviews to a few people to find out about that is probably a good idea. So yeah, sorry, I don't have an answer for that yet, but I will try to find it.
I see we've got some questions in the chat. Sunny Yu asks, do you find students relying too much on technology, especially online translation programs?
I think I teach conversation classes and I teach composition classes here. In the composition classes, definitely. They still, a lot of my students have the habit of writing something in Korean, putting it through the computer translation, then trying to fix the grammar on their own. And so that can be a problem. But in my conversation classes, a lot of times in class, students will pull out their phone, they'll look up a word. And it's fast and it's easy and it's really helpful. So I found in conversation class, it doesn't really get in the way. Composition classes, it can, if they're putting in like whole sentences or whole paragraphs or even an entire essay, and putting it in Papago and then just copy pasting the results, it doesn't work so well. But that may be just the limit of, machine translation. But if it's, just words or phrases, it tends to be more useful for my students.
I wonder if because of machine translation and the availability of it, people see consolidation itself as less valuable than they used to.
It may be, yeah. And that's one of the things, not just for vocabulary, but so many things. Like talking to my son, he's in middle school. He's like, oh, why do I have to memorize these things for a test? It's like, yeah, you could just look it up online, like his history test. Yeah. So that may be part of the changing attitude as well, is that, they don't rely on the technology for consolidation, possibly because they don't really see consolidation as necessary, possibly.
And before we finish off, just Shannon wants to know if somebody's wanted to replicate your study, would you be willing to share the survey link?
Yeah, sure. I can stick that in the Discord after the session.
All right, perfect. Thank you very much, Dennis. I'm going to share the Discord quickly. If there are any more questions or comments, you can pop over to the Discord channel and continue this discussion with Dennis. Thank you very much, Dennis. It was very interesting and it's clearly generated some interest. So I hope you all will continue the conversation beyond the session and enjoy the rest of the conference.
Yeah, well, thank you, Garth, and thank you for your questions, everybody, and for your interest.
Well, thank you. Enjoy.
We have time for this one last question?
I will leave it open for that one last question.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, sure. Okay. So how do I take it when students literally depend on technology or machine translation of the language? Well, like I said before, during my conversation classes, they're not translating everything with their smartphones. They're just looking up a word. It's like, oh, how do I say this in English? I never learned it, or I forgot this word. Or they've heard a word that, it's unfamiliar. So, an English word, and they're looking it up. So it's usually just like in conversation class, it's like pinpoint, I've got a problem here. I'm going to look on my smartphone. I'm going to solve it. In composition class, though, like I mentioned, not every student, but I definitely get problems with students kind of over relying on the machine translation. And I think, yeah, it probably does have an effect on long-term learning because they're just relying on the machine, and then maybe, you know, they're probably not really paying that close attention to the output. Same thing happens with my feedback, to be honest. If I give feedback on their writing, some students will pay close attention. They'll come up to me and ask, you know, what did I mean, or how do I fix it? Or, you know, or I think, do I fix it this way? Here's how I think I should fix it. But when students have obviously used machine translation, they usually don't follow up on anything. So it probably does have an effect. But I don't, how big of an effect, I'm not sure.
Right. Thank you very much, Dennis.
Yeah, thanks again.
Right. Enjoy the rest of the conference all.
Yep, thank you.